May 15, 1943. The Atlantic stretched endlessly gray beneath a sky that hadn't seen the sun in days. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stood on the deck of the transport ship, hands gripping the cold steel railing until his knuckles whitened. Salt spray stung his face, but he didn't move. Behind him, in the cargo hold below, 300 German prisoners of war sat in silence, some praying, some staring at nothing, most wondering if they'd ever see home again. Klaus was 26 years old. He'd commanded a panzer crew in North Africa until a British shell had turned his tank into a coffin for everyone but him. The explosion had been instant, a flash of white heat, then screaming metal, then silence. He'd crawled out through the commander's hatch with his uniform smoking and his ears ringing so loudly he couldn't hear his own voice. His crew, Dieter, Hans, young Werner who'd just turned 19, they'd never made it out. Klaus had surrendered with his hands raised high, expecting a bullet. Instead, they'd given him water. Then they'd shipped him west across an ocean that felt wider than any desert. The air smelled different here, cleaner. No cordite, no burning oil, no rotting flesh baking under the Tunisian Sunday, just salt and rust and the faint odor of diesel fuel. Klaus breathed it in and tried not to think about what waited on the other shore. He'd heard the stories. Every prisoner had. Whispered rumors passed between captured men in holding camps across North Africa. Stories about American brutality. About work camps in frozen wastelands where men died by the thousands. About prisoners vanished into mines or factories, worked to death and buried in unmarked graves. The propaganda films they'd watched back in Germany hadn't helped. Images of gangsters with machine guns. Cities ruled by criminals and Jews. A nation of mongrels and capitalists who valued nothing but money and violence. A country built on the backs of slaves, where human life meant nothing and chaos reigned supreme. Klaus had stopped believing most of the propaganda a year ago, somewhere between Tobruk and El Alamein, when reality and rhetoric had diverged too far to reconcile. But still, the unknown gnawed at him. What did the Americans really do with their prisoners? What would they do with him? A voice broke the silence beside him. "Do you think they'll shoot us when we land?" Klaus turned. It was Feldwebel Otto Brenner, a stocky man from Bavaria with a scar that split his left eyebrow in two. Otto had been a baker before the war, a man who'd made bread for weddings and christenings, who'd known his neighbors by name. Now he looked like he'd aged 20 years in two, his face deeply lined, his eyes haunted by things no baker should ever see. "No," Klaus said quietly. "If they wanted us dead, we'd already be at the bottom of the ocean." Otto nodded, but his eyes said he wasn't convinced. None of them were. The logic made sense, but logic and fear rarely lived in the same house. "My cousin," Otto said after a moment, his voice barely audible over the wind. "He was captured by the Russians. At Stalingrad. We never heard from him again. Not a letter, not a word. Nothing." Klaus said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both knew what had happened to German prisoners on the Eastern Front. The stories from there weren't propaganda. They were the truth, and the truth was worse. The ship's horn blasted 3 times. Low, mournful, final. "Land ahead," someone shouted from the bridge. Klaus squinted into the gray. There, a smudge on the horizon, then shapes, then details. Tall buildings rising impossibly high, taller than any cathedral he'd ever seen. Cranes, docks stretching like skeletal fingers into the water. Ships everywhere. More ships than Klaus had seen in his entire life, clustered together like a steel forest. New York. The name alone had weight. Klaus had seen it on maps, heard it in songs his sister used to hum before the war. Seen it mocked in newsreels as a symbol of American decadence. Now it rose before him like a wall of stone and glass, impossibly large, impossibly real, impossibly intact. No bomb craters, no rubble, no burned-out husks of buildings. Just a city, stretching endlessly skyward. Otto crossed himself. "God help us," he whispered. Klaus said nothing. He just watched as America swallowed the sky and wondered if he was sailing toward salvation or damnation. The holding facility at Camp Shanks, New York, smelled like disinfectant and coffee. Klaus hadn't smelled real coffee in months, not since before El Alamein, when supplies had still been reliable and the war had still seemed winnable. It hit him the moment they marched through the gates, rich, bitter, unmistakable. His stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it felt like betrayal. They were processed in groups of 50, stripped, searched, deloused, photographed. The American guards were professional, almost businesslike. No beatings, no shouting, no rifle butts to the ribs or kicks to the kidney. They spoke in clipped English and pointed with batons instead of fists. Their uniforms were clean, pressed, and immaculate. Their boots shined. They looked like they'd stepped out of a recruiting poster rather than a battlefield. One of them, a young private with red hair and freckles scattered across his nose, even smiled at Klaus when he stumbled on the stairs, his legs still unsteady from weeks at sea. "Easy there, pal," the private said, steadying him by the elbow. Klaus blinked. Pal? The word made no sense. He was a prisoner, an enemy. A German officer who'd killed British soldiers and destroyed Allied tanks. Why would this boy call him pal? They were given clean uniforms. Not German uniforms, those had been burned, every swastika and eagle badge incinerated in a steel drum while they watched. Instead, they wore blue denim trousers and shirts with large white letters stenciled across the back. PW. Prisoner of war. Otto tugged at his collar, his fingers clumsy with confusion. "It's soft," he muttered. "The fabric. It's not scratchy." Klaus nodded. He'd noticed too. The uniforms were better quality than what they'd worn in the Wehrmacht toward the end. Cleaner. Newer. No lice. No patches covering patches. The denim was thick and sturdy, the kind of material that would last years, not months. A guard handed Klaus a towel, a bar of soap, and a toothbrush. A toothbrush. Klaus stared at it like an artifact from another world. They were led into a mess hall. Long wooden tables stretched the length of a room, lit by electric bulbs, dozens of them, burning bright without a flicker, without rationing, as if electricity were infinite. Steam rose from metal trays at the front. Klaus's mouth watered before he even saw the food. When he reached the serving line, an American cook, a large black man with a white apron and tired eyes, scooped something onto his tray. His movements were practiced, efficient, not unkind. Mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with real butter, and meat. Klaus stared. "Keep moving," the guard behind him said, not unkindly. Klaus moved. Saturday, he picked up his fork, and for a moment he just looked at his plate. The meat was pork, thick and glistening with brown gravy that pooled at the edges. The potatoes were white and smooth, not the gray mush they'd eaten in North Africa. The bread was soft, not hard as stone. He cut a piece of pork, put it in his mouth, and closed his eyes. It was warm, seasoned, real, not horse meat, not mystery rations, not sawdust mixed with flour. Just pork, cooked properly, with salt and pepper and care. Across the table, Otto was crying. Silently, tears ran down his weathered face as he chewed, his shoulders shaking with something between relief and grief. Another man, a young corporal named Friedrich, with hollow cheeks and a permanent tremor in his hands, just stared at his plate like he'd forgotten how to eat, like the sight of real food had broken something inside him. Klaus swallowed. Then he took another bite. And another. He ate slowly, deliberately, forcing himself not to rush, not to gorge, because his stomach couldn't handle too much after months of near starvation. But every bite tasted like a kind of miracle. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't even close. Around him, 300 German prisoners ate in near silence, broken only by the quiet sounds of forks on metal trays and the occasional sob. After the meal, they were gathered in the yard. An American officer stood on a wooden platform, flanked by translators. He was tall, clean-shaven, with the kind of posture that suggested he'd never missed a meal in his life, never slept in mud, never wondered if tomorrow would bring food or just another empty day. "Gentlemen," the translator began in German, his accent strange but clear, "welcome to the United States. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated humanely. You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will not be tortured. You will not be executed." Silence. Klaus watched the other prisoners' faces. Disbelief, suspicion, confusion. The officer continued, "You will work, but you will be paid. 5 cents per day for unskilled labor, plus 80 cents for skilled work. You will have access to recreation facilities. You will receive mail from home when possible. You will be allowed to attend religious services of your choice." Klaus felt Otto lean close. "Is this a trick?" Otto whispered. "Some kind of psychological game? They fatten us up before. Before what? Klaus interrupted. Otto had no answer. The officer gestured to the barracks behind him, long wooden buildings with glass windows and chimneys jutting from shingled roofs. These are your quarters. You will sleep on cots with mattresses and blankets. You will shower with hot water. You will be inspected daily for contraband, but you will not be mistreated. If you have complaints, there is a process. If you are ill, you will see a doctor. Friedrich laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through the crowd. They're lying, he hissed, loud enough for others to hear. They have to be. It's America. It's the enemy. This is all Passer. But Klaus wasn't sure. Because nothing about this, not the food, not the uniforms, not the officer's calm, measured tone, matched anything he'd been told. Nothing matched the propaganda, the rumors, the warnings. That night, lying on a real mattress for the first time in months, Klaus stared at the ceiling. The mattress was thin, the springs complained beneath his weight, but it was clean. The blanket was wool, scratchy but warm. Through the window beside his bunk, he could see electric lights glowing softly in the American camp beyond the wire. Electric lights. Hundreds of them. As if there were no war. As if energy weren't rationed. As if America had so much of everything that they could waste it lighting empty pathways. Otto's voice came from the bunk below. Klaus? Yes? What if we were wrong? About all of it? Klaus closed his eyes. He didn't answer, because he was thinking the same thing, and the thought terrified him more than capture ever had. 3 weeks later, Klaus arrived at Camp Clarinda, Iowa. The train ride west had been surreal. They'd traveled in passenger cars, not cattle cars, not freight containers, but actual passenger cars with padded seats and windows that opened. Klaus had pressed his face to the glass and watched America scroll past like something from a dream or a lie. Fields. Endless fields of green and gold, stretching to horizons so vast they seemed to curve with the earth. Corn taller than a man, planted in rows so straight they looked drawn with a ruler. Barns painted bright red, sturdy and intact. Towns with white churches and tree-lined streets where children played and waved at the camply train. Women hung laundry in backyards. Men drove tractors through fields. Everything looked normal. Where are the ruins? Otto had asked, bewildered, his face pressed against the glass. Where are the bombed cities? The starving people? The destruction? Klaus didn't answer. He couldn't. Because there were no ruins. No bomb craters. No burned-out vehicles rusting in ditches. No skeletal buildings clawing at the sky. No orphans begging beside the tracks. Just America. Intact and thriving. Untouched by the war that had devoured Europe. Camp Clarinda sat on the edge of a small farming town in southwestern Iowa. Barbed wire fences surrounded rows of identical barracks. Guard towers stood at each corner, and armed sentries walked the perimeter. But beyond the wire, beyond the gates, Klaus could see houses. Normal houses with porches and gardens, and American flags hanging from poles. He could see a church steeple, a water tower, a main street with shops. The camp commandant, a colonel named Patterson, with gray at his temples and a calm, measured way of speaking, addressed them on their first day. You will work on nearby farms, the translator relayed in German. You will harvest crops, repair equipment, and assist with labor shortages caused by the war. You will be paid according to Geneva Convention standards. You will be fed 3 meals a day. You will be treated fairly. In return, you will work hard and cause no trouble. Klaus exchanged glances with Otto. They'd been prepared for forced labor, backbreaking work in mines or factories, the kind of labor that killed slowly. But farming, for pay, the colonel continued. You will have access to recreational facilities. A canteen where you can purchase items with your wages. A library. Athletic equipment. On Sundays, you may attend services or participate in organized activities. Friedrich muttered something under his breath. Klaus couldn't hear it, but he could guess. That night, Klaus lay in his new bunk and listened to the sounds of the camp settling into sleep. Someone was snoring. Someone else was crying quietly. Through the thin walls, he could hear American guards talking and laughing. Outside, crickets sang. The air smelled like grass and earth. It smelled like peace. The next morning, Klaus was assigned to a corn farm 10 miles south of camp. He rode there in the back of a truck with a dozen other prisoners, bouncing along dirt roads that cut through farmland, so rich and expansive it seemed obscene. They were escorted by a single guard, An older man named Sergeant Harper, who chewed tobacco and barely said a word, his rifle resting casually across his lap like he didn't expect trouble. The farmer who met them was named Earl. He was 60, maybe older, with sun-beaten skin the color of old leather and hands gnarled from decades of work. He wore overalls and a straw hat. He looked the prisoners over with sharp blue eyes, nodded once, and said something in English that the translator relayed. "Work hard, don't steal, don't cause trouble, and I'll make sure you eat well." Klaus worked. They all did. The corn was thick and heavy, the sun brutal, the hours long. Klaus's hands, soft from months of inactivity, blistered within an hour. His back ached, sweat soaked through his uniform, but the work was honest, simple. There was rhythm to it, a kind of meditation in the repetition. At midday, Earl's wife, a stout woman, named Dorothy, with kind eyes and flour permanently dusted on her apron, brought lunch. Sandwiches, cold milk in glass bottles, fresh tomatoes still warm from the vine, apple pie. Klaus bit into the sandwich and tasted roast beef, real roast beef, layered thick with cheese and mustard on soft white bread that had been baked that morning. Otto stared at his slice of pie like it might explode. "This is better than what I ate before the war," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Better than Christmas dinner with my family." Earl sat with them in the shade of a barn, sipping lemonade from a mason jar. He didn't speak German, and Klaus's English was broken at best, just fragments picked up from guards and translators. But Earl smiled and clapped Klaus on the shoulder and said something that sounded kind, and Klaus understood without needing translation. When they returned to camp that evening, Klaus was exhausted. His muscles screamed, his hands were raw, but his stomach was full. He'd done honest work for honest pay, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. That weekend, the prisoners were given recreation time. Klaus had expected nothing, maybe an hour in the yard to walk in circles. Instead, they were led to a building at the center of camp. Inside was a theater. Rows of wooden chairs, a projector on a stand at the back, a white screen stretched across the far wall. Posters on the walls advertising American films Klaus had never heard of. "Movie night," the guard announced in broken German. "Popcorn's free, enjoy yourselves." Klaus sat down, numb with disbelief. The lights dimmed. The projector whirred to life, its beam cutting through darkness, and suddenly, the screen came alive with images. A Hollywood film, a comedy about a bumbling detective, and a case of mistaken identity. The dialogue was in English, but the physical comedy needed no translation. People stumbled, fell, got hit with pies, an orchestra swelled, characters kissed in the rain. Around Klaus, German prisoners laughed. Actually laughed men who'd killed and nearly been killed, who'd lost friends and country and hope, sitting in an American theater behind barbed wire in the middle of Iowa, eating American popcorn and laughing at an American movie. Otto leaned over, his face illuminated by the flickering screen. "Klaus," he whispered, is this paradise?" Klaus didn't answer. He just watched the screen, the light flickering across his face, and wondered if he'd crossed into some strange, impossible dream, where enemies fed you and entertained you and treated you like human beings instead of vermin. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But it was real. 6 months into his captivity, Klaus received a letter. The envelope was thin, creased, and bore a German postmark from 4 months ago. It had traveled across an ocean, through censors and military channels and bureaucratic labyrinths, to finally reach his hands in a camp in Iowa. Klaus held it for a long time before opening it. His name was written in his mother's handwriting, careful, precise, the way she'd taught him to write when he was 6 years old. When he finally opened it, his hands were shaking. "My dearest Klaus, we received word that you are alive and a prisoner in America. I cannot tell you the relief I felt. Your sister and I have prayed every night since we learned you were missing. The church held a service for you. We thought you were dead. Life here is difficult. The rations grow smaller each month. The bombings continue, though not as frequently as before. Your father's shop was destroyed last winter not by bombs, but by fire. He is trying to rebuild, but materials are scarce, and his hands are not as strong as they once were. Your sister married in August, a quiet ceremony. You would have liked him, I think. He works for the postal service. He was injured in Russia and sent home. He limps now, But he is kind to her. I do not know when you will come home. I do not know what will happen to any of us. But I am grateful you are alive. I am grateful you are somewhere safe, even if that somewhere is with the enemy. Please write when you can. Please tell us you are well. With all my love. Mother. Klaus folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, over his heart. He walked to the edge of the barracks and sat on the steps, staring out at nothing. Around him, other men read their own letters. Some wept openly, some smiled, treasuring whatever scraps of home had reached. Friedrich crumpled his letter and threw it in the trash, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with something Klaus couldn't name. What did it say? Otto asked quietly, sitting down beside Klaus. My father died, Friedrich said, his voice flat. Air raid. Last winter. They found him in the rubble of our building. My mother wrote 3 months ago. The letter just arrived. Klaus closed his eyes. The Americans fed them steak twice a week now. They showed them movies every Saturday. They paid them 80 cents a day for farm work. They gave them hot showers and clean clothes and medical care that was better than what many German civilians received. But the wire was still there. The war was still raging. And home, whatever was left of it, felt farther away than the moon. That night, Klaus stood at the fence line, staring out at the Iowa fields under a sky scattered with stars so bright they looked unreal. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. Sergeant Harper was on duty, leaning against the guard tower, smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung casually over one shoulder. Klaus spoke in halting English, the words clumsy in his mouth. Why, you treat us this way? Harper glanced down. He was quiet for a long moment, smoke curling from his lips. Then he shrugged. Geneva Convention, he said simply. Plus, you're just soldiers. Same as my boys over there in Europe. You didn't start this war. You're just caught in it, same as them. Klaus nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. Harper flicked his cigarette into the dirt and crushed it under his boot. My nephew's a prisoner somewhere in Germany, he said quietly. Bomber pilot, shot down over Hamburg last year. I pray every night that whoever's got him is treating him half as good as we're treating you. Klaus felt something twist in his chest. I hope so too, he said. Harper grinned. Go get some sleep, Klaus. Tomorrow's Sunday. There's gonna be a baseball game. Prisoners versus guards. You play? Klaus blinked. I don't know how. You'll learn. It's easy. You hit a ball with a stick and run in circles. Even Friedrich can do it. Klaus almost smiled. I will. Try. Good man. Harper clapped him on the shoulder and walked back to his post. Klaus stood there a while longer, watching the stars, thinking about his mother and his sister and his father's shop, burned to ash. Thinking about Harper's nephew in some German camp, hopefully alive, hopefully treated with mercy, thinking about a war that had turned the world upside down, where enemies fed each other and prayed for each other and taught each other baseball. The war ended in Europe on the 8th of May, 1945. Klaus heard the news in the camp mess hall. The radio crackled with static, then a voice American, triumphant, final. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Third Reich was finished. The room fell silent. Klaus set down his fork. Around him, 300 German prisoners sat frozen, trying to process what they'd just heard. Some men cheered those who'd never believed in the cause, who'd been drafted against their will, who'd wanted nothing but to survive and go home. Some cursed, bitter, angry, lost. Some just sat, staring at nothing, trying to understand what it meant to have lost everything. Otto put a hand on Klaus's shoulder. We're going home, he said quietly. It's over. We can go home. But Klaus knew better. It wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was. Friedrich stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Home? He said, his voice rising. Home to what? Rubble? Ruins? Occupation? We have no home. We have nothing. No one argued with him, because he wasn't wrong. Repatriation took time. Months turned into a year. Klaus remained at Camp Clarinda, working the farms, watching movies, and playing baseball. He got better at it, learned to swing properly, to judge the arc of the ball, to run the bases without tripping over his own feet. The guards were kinder now, less watchful. Some even joked with the prisoners, taught them English slang, and shared cigarettes. Earl invited Klaus to his house for Thanksgiving, an American holiday Klaus had never heard of. Klaus sat at a table with Earl's family, ate turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce, and tried to explain in broken English what Berlin had looked like before the bombs, what his father's shop had been like, what his sister's laugh sounded like. Dorothy cried. Earl shook Klaus's hand and said, "I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry for all of it." Klaus didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded and said, "Thank you." In February of 1946, Klaus finally boarded a ship back to Europe. He stood on the deck with Otto and 200 other prisoners, watching America fade into the horizon. The Statue of Liberty grew smaller and smaller, that great green woman with her torch raised high until she was just a speck, then nothing. The ship turned east, toward a continent that had torn itself apart. Otto stood beside him, silent for a long time. Then, "Do you think they'll believe us?" he asked. "When will we tell them what it was like?" Klaus shook his head. "No. Because how could he explain? How could he tell people who'd starved and bled and lost everything that he'd spent 2 years eating steak and watching movies? That he'd been paid to pick corn? That American farmers had invited him into their homes and fed him at their tables? Those guards had taught him baseball and wished him luck when he left? How could he say that, for a brief and impossible time, he'd forgotten he was a prisoner at all? How could he say that the enemy had shown him more mercy than his own government ever had? Klaus returned to a Germany that no longer existed. The country had been divided, carved up by the victors like a carcass. His city was rubble, block after block of shattered buildings and empty streets. His home was gone, just a crater filled with broken bricks and twisted metal. His mother had survived, living in a single room with his sister and her new husband. His father's shop was in ashes. Klaus found work as a carpenter. He rebuilt. He married. He had children. He lived a long, quiet life. But sometimes, late at night, he thought about Iowa, about the fields stretching to impossible horizons, about popcorn and baseball games, and Dorothy's apple pie, about Sergeant Harper smoking under the stars and asking about his nephew, about Earl clapping him on the shoulder and treating him like a man instead of a monster, and he wondered if he'd dreamed it all. He kept his mother's letter his entire life, folded carefully in his wallet. He kept a photograph too, one taken at the camp, all the prisoners standing in rows, some smiling, some not. Otto was there, and Friedrich, and dozens of others whose names Klaus eventually forgot. But he never forgot Iowa. He never forgot that in the middle of the worst war in human history, in a place where he should have been treated as an enemy, he'd instead been treated as a human being. And that, more than anything else, was what stayed with him. Klaus Richter's story wasn't unique. Over 371,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States during World War II. They worked on farms, in factories, in forests. They were paid. They were fed. They were treated according to the Geneva Convention. Most were shocked by what they found. Not brutality, but mercy. Not starvation, but abundance. Not cruelty, but a strange, confusing kindness that contradicted everything they'd been told about America. Some stayed after the war, unwilling to return to a destroyed homeland. Some married American women. Some built new lives in the country that had once been their enemy. For Klaus and thousands like him, America remained a paradox, a place that had imprisoned them and fed them, held them captive and treated them with dignity. A place where, behind the wire, they'd glimpsed something they'd never expected: humanity.